Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rachel Stark, and I am the Commercial Director of Two Blues Solar. Today's webinar is part of Energy Security and Green Infrastructure Week and is for anyone considering installing on-site solar. We're going to look a bit about the role that solar can play within your overall business sustainability strategy and how it might contribute to a reduction in your energy costs. The webinar will probably last around 30 minutes. There'll be a Q&A session at the end. So I think there's a little questions box at the bottom if you want to ask any questions, and then we'll answer them towards the end. But before we sort of get started into the bulk of the webinar, I just wanted to introduce our business and who we are briefly. So Two Blue Solar exists really to help commercial and industrial businesses benefit from on-site solar, whether that be rooftop or ground mount. Essentially, we fund 100% of the installation and ongoing maintenance costs at a client site, and we then sell them the power back via what's called a power purchase agreement, typically at rates that are quite a lot lower than they'd be paying to their existing energy supplier. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about how power purchase agreements work later in the webinar, but firstly, I wanted to talk about solar more broadly and its role within a sustainability strategy. But before I get going, I wanted to find a little bit more about you guys listening in the audience and why you joined the webinar. So provided I get the tech right, let's see if we can just do a quick poll. So I'm going to hopefully publish a poll that you will see any minute on your right-hand side. So at the bottom right-hand side, apparently, there should be a poll coming up. So you can tick all the ones that apply to you. So why are you interested in solar? Is it about your energy costs? Is it about security, PR benefits? Is it just that you feel you're under pressure to reduce your carbon footprint? Or is it simply a key business priority? So if you vote now. Brilliant. Let me see if I can submit that vote. Okay, so we can see the votes there. Hopefully you can see them too. And I can see there's, I mean, a lot of, unsurprisingly, a lot of different factors and pressures driving people, but good to see that sustainability is a key business priority, unsurprisingly for a lot of you here. That seems to be topping the poll. But given all of these pressures and drivers, it's not surprising, as I'm sure you're all aware, that the rollout of solar in the UK has increased exponentially in the past 10 years. So if you will move on to this next slide here, you can see that back in 2010, we were on 95 megawatts. It's gone to about 14,000 megawatts today, and there's a goal of 70,000 megawatts by 2035. And the UK currently generates about 4 to 5% of its electricity from solar, with hopefully a lot more to come, obviously, with that 2035 target. So what does that all mean? Well, it means it's a very well-established technology. It can also generate reasonably quick wins compared to other types of renewable energy, such as wind. So a rooftop solar system, for example, can typically be up and running within 6 months. It can improve your building's EPC ratings, roughly by a grade. An average-sized system can save up to 30 tons of carbon each year. That's equivalent to around 1,300 trees. On average, we find it provides around 20 to 40% of your energy needs, which obviously will save you significant cost in the process. And finally, it's a very tangible and visible sustainability win. So a really good thing, I think, to show both customers and employees. So there's clearly a lot of benefits, but despite all of this, apologies, only 5% of the UK's warehouse rooftops have solar. So why is this? We've got a few thoughts on it ourselves, but before I talk about what we think, let's just do one more quick poll and find out what you guys think. So I will put this up on the screen, hopefully. So interested to hear about why you haven't yet installed solar across your sites. Perhaps you're focusing on other sustainability solutions, perhaps your premises aren't suitable, perhaps you're not totally convinced that it's going to do what you want it to do, maybe it costs too much or has too much payback period, or there's a lack of time and resource. So again, I can see the results popping up on my screen here, and a variety of different answers here. Interestingly, cost seems to be a reasonably big one. Good to see that not convinced it will be beneficial enough hasn't got a huge number of votes, because historically this was one of the barriers, because a lot of people thought that UK might not have the weather for solar. This isn't really the case, but there are nevertheless some limitations to solar which may still make people cautious about moving forward with it. I think we've all experienced this year, we don't live in a country where sunny summers are guaranteed. It can be pretty dark and cold in winter, so solar isn't going to do a huge amount for you in the winter months. But I don't want to give you the impression that we need to live in Spain for solar to work. Fortunately, sun isn't essential, as you can see from these graphs on this slide. So we did some analysis recently and looked at the potential for a solar system on an average-sized commercial roof in various cities across the UK, from Glasgow in the north down to Eastbourne in the south. I lived in Glasgow for 4 years, a really awesome city, but I did rarely see sun. But you can see nevertheless on this graph here, this green line is Glasgow, that whilst there are differences in outputs, it nevertheless isn't quite as different as you might think based on the different locations. And solar does still work even where the sun doesn't shine very much. And that's really because it's based on irradiance levels rather than sunshine specifically. So in reality, hopefully this shows that the location of your business within the UK shouldn't be a particular barrier to solar. But the profile of your business operations will impact the extent to which solar will be beneficial. So if, for example, lots of your energy use is overnight, perhaps you're charging electric vehicles, solar might not be hugely helpful. Now, hopefully, battery storage solutions will become more economically viable in the future, but at the moment, it's often hard to justify that financially for businesses. And it's also worth noting in general that even if the majority of your operations are during the day, solar is never going to provide 100% of your energy needs. It's not a panacea, but it can form a really powerful part of your overall sustainability strategy. And I'd always encourage all businesses to speak to a solar professional to understand how good a match it is for their business operations and premises. So just looking back at that poll, I can see that that hesitancy is less of a barrier to take up than it used to be. So I guess the question is, what else slows expansion? Why isn't everyone jumping at the chance to install solar on their roofs? Well, I think the second reason sometimes relates to the payback period. Solar has reduced in price significantly over recent years, but the payback period is still likely to be around 5 to 7 years. Now, if you're a tenant and haven't got a long time left on your lease, this might seem prohibitive. And even if you do have a long lease, or you're an owner occupier, it might be hard to justify the capital outlay with your finance team. I do find that in an inflationary environment, finance directors can be quite cautious about parting with large amounts of money and are more likely to want to focus their investment on core business activities. Another challenge may be landlord willingness. We are seeing more landlords installing solar on tenants' behalf, but this might come with a rent increase, and it's often quite a slow process, as it's often not the landlord's top priority. So these different parties can act as constraints, not to mention the obvious time and resource constraints. So we've spoken to loads of companies who've had solar on their to-do list for years, but they haven't always had the time or the expertise to assess the financial viability, compare all the systems, and manage the process. Now, the good news is that despite talking about all these constraints, there are lots of ways to overcome them, and they're really some of the reasons that we founded Two Blues Solar. So, for example, there are now lots of options available to businesses that allow you to access finance and avoid any capital outlay. And you can also access professional experts who will manage the entire process for you, including liaising with your landlord and managing the consents process. So all in all, hopefully lots of reasons to forge ahead. And there have been recent studies showing that if solar was installed, get it right, on only half of the largest 20% of warehouses, we could double the UK's current solar capacity. So at Two Blue Solar, we're obviously keen to carry on with this journey, and I'm assuming that many of you joining here are also keen to take advantage of your roof or your lands. So I'd like to now look at some of the key factors you need to consider when embarking on a solar project. So firstly is about understanding what solar can do for you. If you're not sure how much solar can contribute to your business, really good idea to get a professional to look at your annual energy consumption and model a system for you. So we do this regularly for businesses as part of our proposals, and we'll look at the optimal size system for your site. What land you've got, roof, maybe carports, how much of the energy that's produced will you use, and how much of your overall energy needs will be met. We'll look at future business goals, how much carbon and cost savings you'll make. And really the intention of all of this is to help you make an educated decision about whether solar will work for you. As we all know, sustainability goals really work best when they are financially sustainable and viable as well. Next step, obviously, will be to choose your installer. There are a huge number of commercial solar installers of varying levels of expertise and quality. I'm not going to go into it in detail today, but we do actually have an article available on our website that talks about it a bit more. But needless to say, as you all know, it's critical that you do your due diligence. It can be quite hard sometimes to compare solar quotes on anything other than price, but there are lots of other important things to consider, whether that be quality of equipment, warranties, installation quality, looking at the requirements of your roof warranty. All of these things should be looked at. You know, you're putting something on your roof for a long time, so it really needs to keep on working. Next year, timescales. So we find that lots of clients we talk to, they're coming to us because they've got an energy contract perhaps that's about to end, and they're concerned about future pricing and want to get a solar system installed before their price goes up. So if that's the case, bear in mind that it typically takes a minimum of 6 months from the time that you choose your installer to having a system go live. And I imagine that most companies require another 3 months before that to do all their due diligence. And ideally, you want to get a system installed by sort of March, April, so that you can get the benefit of the summer months, because that's when the bulk, spring and summer is when the bulk of the benefit is. So if, for example, you wanted a system that was working by summer 2024, you'd need to start considering your options now. Next thing to consider is maintenance and reporting. Solar panels obviously need to be looked after. They have a 35 to 40 year life scale potentially, but only obviously if they're taken care of. So if you're looking to invest yourself and potentially assessing the payback period, you need to factor in about £5,000 to £10,000 annually for an average size system for reactive and proactive maintenance costs, and then obviously scale that up by inflation for the full lifetime of your panels. You also need to ensure the system can be monitored and that you can get meaningful data, so you know you're getting the optimum performance from them. I spoke to a client the other day and he told me he got reams of data from his solar, but he had no idea what any of it meant. So obviously really important that that's usable data. Solar panels typically lose about 0.4% of their efficiency each year, but obviously if something goes wrong with the system, they'll perform more poorly. So what we do at Tube Blues is we install irradiance sensors on our panels so we can constantly compare the performance they should be achieving based on the irradiance levels of the location versus the output they're providing, and then obviously respond accordingly. Finally is need to consider obviously how you're going to pay for your solar system. Some companies will pay for it all themselves up front, and a commercial solar system for an energy intensive business is likely to cost anything from £200,000 all the way up to above £1 million. So obviously for some businesses this cost might be prohibitive. Now the good news is that there are other options available. Some installers will let you pay over an extended period, essentially offering a form of asset finance. That, of course, can spread the cost, but it does put a debt on your balance sheet, and it can sometimes lead to high upfront costs and minimal initial savings. And then there are also power purchase agreements available, which I mentioned right at the start. Now, in truth, there are pros and cons of each option, and what's best for you will depend on your own individual business circumstances. And there is another article, in fact, on our website looking at these different options in more detail. And the reason we write some of these articles is that one of our goals really is to help businesses make informed decisions. So we're always providing as much information as possible about solar, even if that means that ultimately someone funds it in a different way to what we're offering. So what are we offering? We are offering power purchase agreements. Let's look at them in a bit more detail. So with a power purchase agreement, someone else installs and owns the asset. They provide all the upfront capital, manage the process, and are responsible for the long-term maintenance. As a client, you simply buy the power you consume from them. Now, a PPA is typically 10 to 25 years in length with a fixed or inflation-linked price, and unsurprisingly, the longer the term, the lower the price. Prices typically range from 10 to 20 pence per kilowatt hour. Now, if you compare that with average energy prices right now, probably 28, 29p, you can see that there are significant savings to be had. And once the term ends, the assets transfer into the freeholder's ownership and they benefit from free energy for the remainder of the panel's life. Now, this table here compares a PPA model versus a self-funded model. As you can see, there are lots of benefits of the PPA model. You don't have to worry about the maintenance because that's the PPA provider's responsibility, and their interests are very much aligned with yours because they make their money by ensuring that the solar system is performing optimally for the full term of the contract they have with you. You get immediate OPEX savings without any CAPEX outlay, and you outsource the entire project management and procurement risk. Now, I am aware that when I discuss PPAs like this, it can sound a little bit too good to be true. And lots of prospective clients that we speak to will ask us, what is the downside? Because there must be a catch. Now, in truth, there aren't a lot of downsides, but it won't be available to everyone. And there are things to consider when choosing a PPA provider and when comparing it to a sort of a self-funded option. So I guess on that note, firstly, who qualifies? Well, the good news is that PPAs are available to tenants, even if you're on a short lease, although landlords will, of course, need to consent, and your PPA provider will need to liaise with them. They're also available to landlords or owner-occupiers looking to roll out over their whole portfolio. But they do typically work best for high energy users. And by that, I mean people or businesses rather using more than about 400,000 kilowatt hours per year, who perhaps have a minimum size roof of 2,000 square meters. Businesses with multiple smaller sites will also likely qualify. And the reason for this limitation is that the PPA provider makes money by selling energy to the client. So if you've got a really small roof or you're not using much of the energy provided by the system, then lots would have to be exported to the grid, and it's unlikely to be financially viable for both parties. So if you're not sure whether your roof or energy requirements are right for a PPA, please come to chat to us because we can let you know. If you are the right business profile, the next thing to do is to make sure you compare the payback of a self-funded versus a PPA model. Now, we will always provide this information to you as part of our proposal. So as an example, you can see a sort of a typical graph, hopefully on the screen. Now, the orange line shows the savings associated with a self-funded model, and the blue line shows those of a PPA model. Now, what this shows is that for the first 7 years, PPA provides savings while the self-funded model doesn't. After that, at year 7 or 8, you can see the self-funded model breaks even and starts generating savings, but it's not until around sort of year 16 here that the savings generated by the self-funded model exceed the savings generated by the PPA. So if I just explain a little bit more how we sort of come across this graph, or how we build this graph, the savings of the PPA are very simply calculated. Simply what you would have paid to the market versus what you pay to us over the term of the contract. And we use forecasts of energy prices made by experts such as Aurora or Baringa to calculate the savings. Now, you might have heard that wholesale electricity prices are expected to fall slightly in the coming years, and you can see this in the kind of light grey bars down here. But as you can see from the graph, overall energy prices are expected to increase. And that's really because a large proportion of your bill is made up of taxes and transmission costs. And these are expected to increase simply due to the large costs associated with the upgrade of the UK's network to hit net zero targets. So if we just look back at this original graph, how have we come across this orange line? Now, essentially, we look at various parameters. So obviously, you're starting negatively because you've made an initial outlay. Now, that initial outlay is then recouped each year by the savings made on your energy. So you're now not paying anything for the solar energy you're consuming. You may also earn some export income. Perhaps if you don't use all of the energy from the system, you'll export it, although worth bearing in mind that prices aren't particularly high for this. Obviously, that is then countered by the ongoing maintenance cost and your cost of capital, which for this example, we've assumed to be sort of roughly 5%. Now, this is a fairly typical example, and and we see it with a lot of clients, over the long run, essentially, a self-funded model is likely to generate higher savings. But you'll probably have to wait a long time for this, and you won't experience the immediate savings of a PPA model. So essentially, it is a commercial decision as to which model you prefer and which one really works best for your business. So if you choose that you do want to go down the PPA route, a few things to just consider when choosing a PPA provider. Firstly, flexibility. What do I mean by that? Well, perhaps flexibility of contract term, for example. Can they accommodate a short lease? Do they offer, different pricing methodologies, fixed price, RPI linked? If you need roof repairs, would they cover these costs and incorporate it into the PPA? And do you have to pay for all the energy that's produced by the system or just what you consume? Next thing to consider is who's involved. Who are the different parties that are parts of it? There may be installation partner, a funding partner, and a maintenance partner. You're likely, or you should just have one point of contact, but it's nevertheless good to understand who these parties are and know their past experience so you feel comfortable with them. And then finally, I think understands how they've determined the price you're going to pay. Most PPA providers will give you an initial price based on a desktop survey of your site and an analysis of your consumption data. But a final price can never be guaranteed until they've done a full site survey, structural survey, and final planning consents have been achieved. So when we're pricing, we typically try to build in a reasonable amount of contingency because the last thing we want to do is come back to a client at a later date with a higher price. So always good to ask your PPA provider about what contingencies are in place and understand at what stage the price will be locked in. And finally, it might sound obvious, but make sure you like and trust them. A PPA is obviously a reasonably long-term agreement, and you want to work with someone who will be transparent and clear with you. So we've covered a lot of topics today, and I hope we've provided some information that will help you with your solar decisions. As I mentioned before, we specialise in solar PPAs, but even if you're looking to self-fund a system, we're always happy to chat to you and answer questions you might have about solar in general. So do just drop us an email. You can see my email address on the screen. We'll assess your site and your energy needs, and we can put together a detailed proposal for you to give you a really in-depth understanding of whether it makes business and financial sense for you. We've also got a monthly newsletter. We post lots of articles and videos on our sites answering some of the kind of commonly asked questions we get from clients. So please do check that out. But in the meantime, I would like to open up the floor to questions. I'm just going to check on my screen here for some of the questions coming in. So there's a question from somebody that says that they already buy all their energy from renewable sources. So is it really sort of worth adding anything by having on-site solar? I think there's two ways to look at that, and we do talk to people about that a lot. Firstly, obviously, when you're buying via REGOs or something like that, you're not actually adding any new renewables to the overall UK grid. When you're doing it on site, then you are genuinely creating additional new renewable generation. Not to mention the fact that you will probably also be able to save costs associated with that too. So from a sustainability and a cost savings perspective, it's still a really good thing. Someone else has asked whether having a PPA might lead to issues around responsibility or issues with the roof. So, and that's also a common question, particularly when we're talking to people who might be in charge of facilities or site maintenance, etc. Obviously very concerned with their roof. So I think the first thing to mention is that if your roof's in really bad shape, then probably best to get it fixed before you put solar on it. And as I mentioned briefly before, we can incorporate the cost of that roof repair potentially within the PPA if that's something that would otherwise be prohibitive. Once solar is up there, it's good to install it, and we typically would install it to make sure that you still have easy access to the roof and to walk around the roof. Solar systems are modular, so they're actually reasonably easy to lift and shift bits of them if there's a bit of the roof that needs to be repaired. So all of those things are reasonably easily taken care of. When we're fixing the solar, obviously we're also taking consideration of your roof warranty to make sure that we wouldn't do anything to invalidate that. So all of these issues are regular things that we would look at and make sure we have solutions in place to all of them. Just have a little look. We've got a few minutes left, so I'll just see if there's somebody's asked whether we specialize in rooftop rather than ground mounts, because I seem to have focused on rooftop in my presentation, so apologies about that. We do both, absolutely. We typically find we do more rooftop than ground mounts, simply because there's more rooftop available. A lot of businesses just don't have the land space to allow them to do ground mounts. Sometimes ground mount will be bigger and it can take a little bit longer to get the consents in place, but absolutely we will do both, and that's part of our role, is to assess your site and to make sure we're putting in place the optimal size system for your energy needs. See if there's a question around how long the installation process takes, because it might cause disruption to business. Installation process, particularly on a rooftop, is typically pretty quick, to be honest. We might be on site for a couple of weeks, and the actual disruption to your business would be extremely minimum. So it's actually, out of all the different types of renewable energy systems, it's probably the simplest to install. Someone else has asked if we need a grid connection if you're using 100% of the power produced. Yes, you will need a grid connection, because it's extremely unlikely that solar is going to provide you with 100% of your energy use. You'll be using energy overnight, for example. You will always need to maintain your existing grid connection and energy supply. What happens when you use your energy on site is that it pulls first from your solar system on your roof or your ground mounts, and then it will pull from any additional that it needs from the ordinary grid connection. Seeing if I've got any other question. A question about, is planning consent always granted? See, good question. So the way planning works is it is, if it is under a one, in England, if it's under 1 megawatt peak system size, it's under permitted development. So a much more straightforward process in getting full planning permission. The more challenging aspect, or the issue that can sometimes cause some problems, is that you have to get consent from your distribution network operator. And occasionally, and they're the ones that run the sort of local electricity networks, occasionally they may put some capacity constraints on the size of the system. So we have had examples where we've gone in for a, 800 kilowatt peak system, and they've come back with something smaller. So that is typically a 3-month process. That is how we kickstart our process. So until we know exactly what it is that we can build, that's one of the things I was talking about before with the pricing. It's not until that is finalized that you can absolutely guarantee your price. But fortunately in the UK, the planning side of it is less complex, unless you're building much larger, above 1 megawatt peak systems, which may of course be the case, and that just takes a bit of a longer time to get that planning in place. Just seeing if I've got any other questions. I'll take just one last question about PPAs compared to asset finance. So I did touch on that briefly, and as I mentioned, there is an article on our website that goes into it in more detail. I would say typically the asset finance is slightly more suitable for smaller sized systems. You are and you're interested in entering into an agreement for a shorter time frame. If you've got a larger system, then the upfront cost of that asset finance might be less attractive, and would certainly mean that you wouldn't get such good OPEX savings from day one. So I would say that PPAs are more suitable for the sort of more energy intensive businesses with the slightly larger system sizes. But again, I would always recommend people, to look at their different options, talk to people, understand the pros and cons of each, because every business is going to be different, and what's best for that business will be different as well, depending on their profile and their needs. And as I said, we're always happy to chat to people about the options available and see what's best for people. Last question is, can we have a copy of the presentation? Absolutely. I will be sending that round afterwards. And as I mentioned before, please do get in touch if you have any questions, or if I've kind of jumped around on the Q&A here. So if I've missed anything out, please do get in touch with me as well. And hopefully we look forward to speaking to some of you in the future. Thank you again very much for joining me today. Bye-bye.